Hello, and welcome to my presentation called The Gift of a Free Roaming Mind. I think in these days where there's a lot of attention placed on mindfulness and focusing our attention, that some of the beautiful creativity and value of just allowing our minds to roam freely gets lost. And so I'm going to describe in this talk some ways to constructively let your mind roam, and to show you that even though it feels like you may be doing nothing at all when you're just in a state of reverie or daydreaming, that in fact your mind is very active and solving problems in the background, and in some ways it can be more constructive or constructive in a different way than when you apply focused attention. So thank you for joining me, and welcome. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the trouble with thinking so much. Cognitive researchers have found that roughly 90% of our thoughts are not helpful. That we tend to, when we think, our thinking patterns are often negative. We have a negativity bias, and we tend to ruminate, worry, hash over the past, things that we've done, things we wish we hadn't done, things we wonder about in terms of what other people are thinking. A lot of this mental activity may seem constructive. Worry, for example, might seem constructive, but in fact, it really causes a lot more anxiety in us. And so the cognitive researchers said, really, there's only a couple of activities that are using focused waking thought that are helpful. And those are to actively solve problems or to plan something. And the rest of the time, our mental activity is actually doing more harm than good. So we need to let our minds rest. And really the big question is not whether we should, but how do we do so? So stay tuned. So a lot of times what we'll do, there's lots of good advice out there about how to redirect our mind toward more positive kinds of thoughts, toward gratitude, thinking of things we're grateful for, bringing ourselves into the present. A lot of these are really related to mindfulness. And I have, nothing against mindfulness per se. I think it has really helped a tremendous amount of people to learn to focus awareness and to become calmer inside and quieter. But the thing about mindfulness is it's actually the opposite of the kind of creative flow that I'm talking about here. Mindfulness is typically a mental practice that requires a lot of self-discipline and commitment, and involves corralling your thoughts into particular kind of awareness that makes it easier for us to focus, makes it easier for us to stay on task. But it's the opposite of flow and daydreaming, which are really the kinds of things that mindfulness is designed to prevent. And the problem really is that when we let our minds roam freely, they don't always go toward the most constructive paths. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the kinds of mind wandering and freedom of thought that are constructive versus the kind that can be unhelpful to us and sometimes even harmful. So one of the things to do to stop thinking so much is to give your mind something else to do, something that occupies it enough that it's going to really not be so busy finding things to worry about. So we can, and a lot of us do, distract ourselves, distract our minds. So we keep it busy by reading, which is a very helpful activity. We can learn a lot from reading. We can entertain ourselves and keep ourselves absorbed in something to prevent us from worrying or ruminating. We can do something that's maybe not as helpful, and that is to engage in social media. And research has really shown that the more time people spend in social media, the less happy they are, because we tend to read all about the great and wonderful things that everyone else is doing and compare ourselves and find ourselves wanting. This is probably one of the most common ways that it erodes our self-esteem. And so I think that really you can distract yourself and you can keep your mind busy with a lot of content, but you really need to be mindful, careful, and choosy about what you attend to, because if you attend to a lot of things that create more anxiety, you're actually defeating the purpose of giving your mind a distraction. So I really advocate for, doing some of that, reading and keeping in touch with what's going on in the world, a limited amount, but to really, when you're not involved in a focused task, to let your mind open up and to free it up with activities like daydreaming and getting into what's called flow. And I'll talk about flow in the next slide. So flow is defined as, and I quote, an absorbing mental state that arises spontaneously when one is engrossed within optimally challenging activity. And so I wonder if you've ever found yourself in an activity where you lost time, where you lost a sense of yourself, where you look up from the painting that you're doing or the game that you're playing, to find that a whole bunch of time has gone by and you haven't even been aware of yourself. And there's such a freedom in this particular kind of mental activity. It involves a completely different set of neural correlates than say, focused activity, or even learning. Say, if I've got the guitar here, learning how to play the guitar does not induce flow. So flow is about this optimally challenging activity, meaning that it's something that we already know how to do without thinking about it too much. And then we can let ourselves flow freely into the activity. And so it's I've listed things like running, walking, creative pursuits of all kinds, gardening, making music if we're adept at making music, many forms of play. And I think about this state as a really creative state and a regulating state. So if we choose things that are rhythmic and involve lots of repetition so that we keep our body busy and our mind somewhat busy, then there's still room for our mind to flow. And in these states, especially if we're absorbed in something that we love, these states can lead us to beautiful, sort of experiential pathways in our mind that in and of themselves feel good, that might bring new ideas and allow also some background activity that solves problems for us. And so it's a very generative state. It feels good when you're in it, and the results of it can be very, very inspiring. And a lot of times we can come up with ideas or just really just engage in mental processes and states that feel helpful and generative. So I hope that when you, if you're cooped up at home during the coronavirus crisis, the pandemic, that you use some of the free time you might have suddenly been freed up with to engage in some things that have the potential to induce flow. And for everybody, I think these activities can be different. They can be knitting or painting or, playing a game that's absorbing enough to keep your mind a little bit occupied, and experiment with things, because when you find it, it really can be such a benefit in so many ways. I know for myself, I used to go for a morning run every day, and that was when my mind would just be allowed to flow. And running, it was easier for me. It was when I was quite a bit younger. It was easier for me. I didn't notice all the creaky joints and things. I could just notice that once I got into a rhythm with my breathing and my running, that my mind was just free, and it was a really helpful and therapeutic time where some of my best ideas emerged. So there's another kind of mind roaming that we can also engage in that's not as exhilarating as flow, but easier to achieve. In fact, whenever we turn our minds off, whenever we're not actively focused on a task, our mind goes into what has been called by the cognitive neuroscientists the default mode network. And this default mode Interestingly, it involves a completely different set of neural correlates than when we're engaged in a focused task. We tend to use the front part of our brain for focused tasks, and in mind wandering, there's a whole different kind of set of neural correlates that are activated. Our mind is just as active, but active in a completely different way. And so it can bring up a whole different trains of thinking, different thoughts, different ways of solving problems, different ways of creating solutions. But the thing about mind wandering is it's not as purely positive as flow. There are different kinds of mind wandering and different kinds of daydreaming. Daydreaming is another word for mind wandering. And so it's helpful to know which things can be helpful and which can't be, because spending too much time in the default mode can be associated with increased mental illness, in particular anxiety, depression, and it's also been associated with schizophrenia. And mindfulness does reduce the amount of time we spend in the default mode. It brings us back into the frontal cortex, into the front of our brains. But I don't think that reducing the time we spend mind wandering is the answer here. I think that what we need to do is look at how the kinds of ways that we allow our mind to wander. So it's useful to have some ability to mindfully watch where our thoughts tend to go and be able to switch tracks if they go into a direction that creates distress. So if we let our mind wander freely and all we tend to do is worry or think about things we've done in the past that we wish we'd done differently, or ruminate about aspects of ourselves that we don't like, or any kind of repetitive, negative kind of train of thought, which I often will call the inner critic. We have these really unhelpful ways of thinking when we're just letting our mind roam freely, then this is something that we need to change. This is why maybe trying to head more toward flow is helpful. So if you're just sitting at your desk or in your bed, or when you wake up, or anywhere that you're habitually just allowing yourself to ruminate, then it's not a good idea to keep going along those tracks, but to change them. And so what one study has shown is that if we let ourselves daydream, to imagine positive experiences and put ourselves into wonderful places, or revisit times in our life that we loved, that can really lead to a sense of well-being, and it allows a lot of our problem solving to happen in the background, because there's still enough space in our mental capacity for that. And what they found is kind of interesting in this one study, where they studied types of daydreaming. And what they found is that the further from potential reality our daydreaming wandered, so the more we engage in sort of wish-fulfilling fantasies like marrying the movie star of our dreams, or becoming, fabulously wealthy beyond what maybe is realistic in our particular life situation. Anything that was so far from really plausible didn't help us feel better. It made us feel worse, I guess, because of the difference between what we were daydreaming about and what's physically possible. But if we daydream about some things that are pleasant, that we love, that are within the realm of within the realm of our current reality, or don't stray too far from that, then this kind of daydreaming has been shown to really be positive and lift our mood. And so I think really letting your mind wander freely is maybe going a little too far. It's really about letting our mind wander freely within the range of things that are constructive and helpful, and somewhat within the realm of possibility. So to go even a step further, we can also engage with our dreaming. And of course, we have to be awake to recall our dreams and pull back the information and the images that come in our dreams. But this, I think, is the ultimate form of mind wandering, because when we're dreaming, our executive functioning is dampened down, and so all of the things that would corral our thoughts and the images that come into some more familiar boxes, all of those functions have been shut down, and our minds are free to roam on very different tracks. And again, the neural correlates of dreaming are another completely different set than daydreaming and then focused thinking. And a dream researcher named Ernest Hartman thought that dreaming is another form of thought, a very creative form of thought that's on a continuum that ranges from dreaming at one end to daydreaming and reverie and some fantasy kind of activities in the middle, and then waking focused thought at the other end. And it's really useful to capture the kinds of ideas that come up in our dreaming, because they are among the most creative. In fact, at the bottom you'll see I've written down a book title called The Committee of Sleep. And this is a book by a Harvard professor named Deirdre Barrett, who looked at all of the creative ideas that have arisen in the world, in the history of the world, through dreaming, including things like Einstein's theory of relativity and the Beatles' beautiful song Yesterday. So, and also there's a brain science, optimization guru named Jim Quick, who says that one of the first activities that he does in the day is when he wakes up, he writes down and records and pays attention to his dreams, because it is a shame to waste all that creative thinking that happens in the night. We dream about 2 hours worth of dreams every night. And while we can only capture a fraction of them, it's really worthwhile to spend time with what comes and to try and maybe understand what the dreams are telling us. And I have lots of ideas if you're interested in how to do that. You can go to my website, which I will list at the end of this presentation, because dreams can appear kind of nonsensical sometimes, and sometimes they're clear to us, and sometimes they really need a little bit of engaging with and deciphering. But it's well worth the effort, because it's another avenue of creativity that is, I think, largely untapped by so many of us. And I think some of our most creative ideas come to us when we're dreaming. So the main takeaway that I would love for you to remember from this particular presentation is that work, rest, and play, that combination of that, the balance of that, is just as important for your mind as it is for your body. And so sometimes you can actually combine the play for your body with the rest for your mind. They don't always have to happen in exclusive time frames, but can run along parallel tracks. For example, my habit of walking or running and letting my mind roam free is something I recommend. So don't always have music playing, or background music might not hamper the freedom that your mind needs. But if you're listening to podcasts or shows while you're running, then it won't allow your mind the freedom that it needs to rest certain faculties and to turn on others, and to allow the creative problem solving that happens in the background to really start to function. When we're engaged in focused waking thought, it takes a lot of mental energy, and it also shuts off other forms of mental creativity, that the access to our unconscious, to the wider field of knowledge that we have been exposed to, isn't as accessible when we're focusing our thoughts. And a really simple example is when you have forgotten a particular word, or you've forgotten the name of something, and you try very, very hard to pull it back. You focus your mind and it doesn't seem to work. And then what you notice is, as soon as you turn toward other things and just let that go, the word or the phrase that you've been actively searching for pops up in your mind. And this is a really small and simple example of how that creative problem solving in the background functions when we switch modes. So I hope that this has inspired you to give yourself a little bit of freedom and to let your mind wander as you navigate this strange new world we find ourselves in, where maybe you have a little bit more freedom and a little more time for things like daydreaming and mind wandering. Don't think of it as unproductive time or as a waste of your time, because as your mind wanders in the background, some of the answers that you're looking for are already forming.
It's Dr. Leslie Ellis here, and I sure hope you enjoyed this presentation on the benefits of allowing your mind to wander. It's one of my favorite topics, and I also, at the same time as I was researching this short presentation, I wrote an article called Freeing the Mind, and it includes some of the references I used for creating this presentation. So if you care to dive a little deeper, feel free to input the link here on this page, and you'll get a free PDF about this topic. And you're also welcome to email me with questions or to check out my website for more about daydreaming, dreaming, and other embodied experiential practices that I offer for therapists and for anybody who's interested in exploring your inner life more deeply. So thanks for your attention, and I hope to see you in some other presentations and courses.